The morning I found out I had $1.9 million sitting in a trust fund I didn't even know existed, I was eating a gas station sandwich in my car because I couldn't afford to sit inside a restaurant and order anything. That's where I was in my life. 31 years old, working double shifts at a physical therapy clinic, and surviving on $4 sandwiches wrapped in plastic. I didn't tell a single person. Not my mother, not my older sister. Not my aunt who called me every Sunday to remind me I still wasn't married. Nobody. And the reason I stayed quiet wasn't because I was being strategic or clever. It was because I had spent my entire adult life watching the people around me treat money like it was the only thing that made someone worth caring about. I had watched my family rearrange their affection based on who had the most of it. And I needed to know before I changed anything about my life who actually saw me. Not the number. Me. So, I kept going to work. I kept splitting my groceries into 2 trips so each receipt stayed under $40. I kept wearing the same 3 pairs of scrubs I'd had since 2019. And I watched. And I waited. My mother had never been cruel in an obvious way. She wasn't the type to scream or throw things. She was the kind of woman who made you feel small with a single look, a slight pause before answering, a comment delivered so gently that you couldn't even be sure it was meant to hurt. Growing up, my older sister was always the one she pointed to when relatives visited. Good grades, good posture, good instincts about people, my mother would say. I was the one with her head in the clouds. The impractical one. The one who wanted to study something useful like nursing, but ended up in physical therapy because at least it paid decently, which was the closest my mother ever got to approving of a decision I made. My sister was 4 years older than me and had married a man who worked in finance. They lived in a house with a 3-car garage and a finished basement and a wine refrigerator that held more bottles than I'd consumed in my entire life. My sister was not unkind to me the way some siblings are. She didn't mock me or belittle me to my face. What she did was something quieter. She excluded me. She made plans that I was never part of. She had a whole life that existed in a separate atmosphere, and the only time our worlds overlapped was when our mother required it. The person in my family I actually liked was my brother's wife. Her name was Delia, and she had come into our family 7 years earlier, looking slightly terrified, which was the correct response to meeting all of us at once. My brother Marcus was loud and opinionated in a way that my mother found charming and I found exhausting. Delia was quieter. She noticed things. She was the only one at my grandmother's funeral who sat next to me instead of across from me. She was the only one who ever asked how a specific patient of mine was doing after I'd mentioned them in passing, weeks later, remembering the detail, asking the follow-up. Small things. The kind of small things that are actually enormous when you've grown up in a house where nobody retained anything you said past the moment you said it. Delia worked as an elementary school teaching assistant and drove a 2014 Civic that made a sound every time she accelerated that she described as just its personality. She and Marcus lived 40 minutes from me. They were not wealthy. Marcus managed a mid-size hardware store and did fine, but fine is not the same as comfortable, and comfortable is not the same as secure. I knew from small comments Delia made, not complaints, just facts she offered without drama, that they were working through some credit card debt, and that replacing the Civic was something they were saving toward, and that the saving was going slowly. I want to tell you about the day I decided to find out what people were made of. It was a Tuesday in October, and I had just come off a 10-hour shift. I was sitting in the parking lot of my apartment complex, too tired to go inside, eating crackers from my bag. My phone buzzed. It was a group text my mother had started, the kind she sent when she wanted an audience about a family dinner she was planning for the following weekend. My sister had already responded with 3 enthusiasm emojis. Marcus had sent a thumbs up. Nobody had texted me directly to see if I was coming. I was assumed to be available because I was always assumed to be available. The way furniture is assumed to be present. I typed a response saying I'd be there, and stared at the crackers in my hand. And something in me just settled, went very still, the way water goes still right before something surfaces. I had $1.9 million. My great-aunt Ruthie, who had moved to Arizona when I was 12 and whom I had visited twice, had left it to me specifically, in a trust that had finished processing 3 months earlier. Her attorney had reached me through certified mail that I'd almost thrown away because I assumed it was a collections notice for a medical bill I'd forgotten about. Ruthie had never married. She'd worked as an accountant for 40 years and had invested quietly and seriously and had, it turned out, thought about me. Her note to me, included with the legal documents, said only, "You were always the one who listened when I talked. I hope this gives you room to breathe." I had read that note 11 times. And I had told no one. What I did next, I am not entirely proud of. I want to be honest about that. The version of me that existed before all of this was not a person who tested people. But grief and loneliness do things to you over time, and I had been lonely in the specific way that happens when you're surrounded by family and still cannot find anyone who is actually looking at you. So I did it. I called my mother on a Thursday evening and I told her I was in trouble. I kept it simple. I told her I'd been covering some unexpected expenses. I used the word expenses without explaining further, which I knew she wouldn't press me on because asking follow-up questions wasn't something she did when she suspected the answer would be uncomfortable and that I was about $800 short on my rent that month. I told her I hated asking. I made my voice quiet in the way it genuinely is when I'm embarrassed. I waited. There was a pause. My mother said she wished she could help, but that she and my stepfather were in the middle of refinancing something, which was a phrase she had used before in situations where I later learned there was no refinancing happening. She said I should look into a payment plan with my landlord. She said she'd keep me in her prayers. She said she loved me. And she said it the way people say words they've been saying for so long they don't hear them anymore. We hung up. I sat with the phone in my hand. I want to tell you I felt something dramatic. Betrayal, maybe. Rage. What I actually felt was a dull, settling confirmation. Like when a doctor tells you something you already suspected and you don't feel shocked, just heavy, just tired of having been right. I called my sister next. She answered on the fourth ring, and I could hear her television in the background. I told her the same thing I'd told my mother, almost word for word. My sister made a sound that was not quite a word, something sympathetic and airy, and she told me she had a lot going on right now with her husband's work schedule and the kids' activities, and that $800 was just not something they had liquid right now, which I knew was untrue because 3 weeks earlier she had mentioned casually that they'd just done a kitchen renovation. She said I should call back if things got really bad. I thanked her. We said goodbye. Then I opened a text message thread with Delia. I typed the same words I'd used with the others. Rent short. Hate to ask. Not sure what to do. My phone rang 40 seconds later. Not a text back. A call. Delia's voice was tight, in a way that told me she'd moved into another room so Marcus wouldn't hear immediately. She asked me what I needed. Exactly. I said $800. She was quiet for 3 seconds, I counted, and then she said, "Okay. I need to move some things around. Can I get it to you by Saturday?" I told her Saturday was fine. She said, "Actually, can I just bring it? I want to see you anyway. I'll bring lunch." She drove 40 minutes on a Saturday morning with cash in an envelope and a bag of sandwiches from a deli I'd mentioned liking once, months ago, and she sat at my small kitchen table and talked to me for 2 hours about nothing consequential and everything real. She asked about my patients. She told me about a kid in her class who had finally started speaking up during group reading. She didn't treat the envelope like a big thing, just set it on the table and pushed it toward me without ceremony, without making me say thank you in any particular way. When she left, I stood at my window and watched her Civic with its personality pull out of the parking lot. And then I did something I hadn't let myself do in the months since I'd learned about the trust. I cried. Not from sadness exactly, from the specific feeling of being seen by someone who was not looking for anything in return. I went back to my attorney the following week. I want to tell you I had a dramatic plan. I didn't. What I had was clarity. I knew what I wanted to do, and I did it without performing it for anyone. The first thing I did was find Delia a good used car. I didn't tell her I was doing it. I did the research, found a certified pre-owned Honda CR-V with low miles and a clean history, and I paid for it outright. Then I called her on a Wednesday evening and asked if she could meet me somewhere Saturday morning. She said yes without asking why. I took her to the dealership and handed her the keys. She looked at the key fob, then at me, then at the car, then back at me. She said, "What is this?" It was not a question, technically. It was the sound of a person whose brain has stopped processing correctly for a moment. I told her I had something to tell her. We sat in the dealership parking lot in my car, and I told her everything: the certified mail, the attorney, Great Aunt Ruthie and the accountant savings, and the note, the trust, the number, the reason I had said nothing. And then I told her about the test, and this is the part where I had to hold her gaze, because I was not proud of it, and I did not want to dress it up. I told her what I'd done. I told her what my mother had said, what my sister had said. I told her I'd been watching for months, waiting to see if anything surprised me. Delia was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You could have just told me. I would have shown up either way." "I know. That's the point." She cried a little, then laughed at herself for crying, then looked back at the CR-V and shook her head slowly. I asked her something I'd been thinking about for weeks. I asked her if she was happy, not with the car, with her life, with Marcus. Another long quiet. She didn't say anything dramatic. She said that things had been difficult, that they had been difficult for a while, that she had stayed because she thought staying was what you did, but that she had been thinking about what she actually wanted for the first time in years, and she didn't always know how to sit with the answers she was getting. I didn't push her. I told her I just needed her to know that whatever she decided, she had options, real ones, and that I wasn't going anywhere. 4 months later, Delia filed for divorce. I want to be careful about how I describe what happened after the family found out about the money, because I don't want it to read like something I enjoyed. I didn't enjoy it. What I felt was more like standing at a window during a storm, watching something you already knew was coming finally arrive. It started with my aunt calling me on a Sunday, the one who called every week to inquire about my marital status, and the conversation had a different texture than usual. She was warmer, more interested in my life specifically. She asked about my work, and then pivoted, smoothly enough that she probably thought I wouldn't notice, to mentioning that she'd heard from my mother that I'd come into some money. She laughed lightly when she said it, like it was nothing, like she was just confirming a small, pleasant rumor. She mentioned a medical procedure she'd been putting off. She mentioned it twice. I told her I hoped she felt better soon. I said goodbye. My mother called 2 days later. This is the conversation I had been both dreading and, if I'm honest, waiting for in a way I'm not entirely comfortable with. She started out sideways, talking about family and closeness and how she'd always tried to be there for me, and I let her talk. I had learned, growing up with her, that the sideways approach always arrived at its real destination, eventually, if you just gave it room. She said she'd been thinking about the future, about stability, about how it would mean so much to her to know I was helping build something lasting for our family. She said our family the way you say something you've practiced. I thought about the Thursday evening when I'd told her I was $800 short on rent. I thought about refinancing something. I thought about, I'll keep you in my prayers. I told her that I was doing well, that I was grateful for what I had, that I was being thoughtful about how I used it, and then I told her, gently, that I didn't have plans to contribute to anyone's expenses right now. I kept my voice level. I didn't perform coldness. I was just honest, which is a thing that is very easy to confuse for coldness when you've grown up in a house where honesty usually came wrapped in something else. My mother made a noise that sat somewhere between wounded and bewildered. She said she didn't understand. She said family was supposed to take care of each other. I asked her, quietly, if she remembered the Thursday evening I'd called about rent. The pause that followed was the longest one of our conversation. She said that was different. I told her I didn't think it was. We ended the call without resolution, which is the only way conversations like that can end. Not with a door slamming, not with words that can't be taken back, but with a kind of mutual recognition that something has shifted, and neither of you is going to pretend otherwise. My sister texted me later that week. She said she'd love to get together soon. She used an emoji I had never seen her use with me before. I responded that I'd love that too, and then let the thread sit without suggesting a date, because I had noticed that when I didn't do the logistical work of making something happen, it didn't happen, which told me what I needed to know about whose idea the togetherness actually was. I want to tell you about what I did with the money, because I think that part matters. I paid off my student loans, which had been a low hum of anxiety in the back of my brain for 8 years. I bought a small house with a yard that gets afternoon light through the kitchen window and has a room I've made into a home office. I didn't tell anyone about the house until I'd already moved in. I decorated it slowly, with things I actually liked, without consulting anyone about whether they were practical. I went back to school part-time for a certification I'd been putting off, because I couldn't afford the program and also because, somewhere in the back of my mind, I'd absorbed the message that wanting more than I had was a form of ingratitude. I'm unlearning that. Delia found an apartment she loves. She adopted a cat she named Ruthie, which she told me about over the phone, and which made me laugh and cry simultaneously. She's been in therapy. She's talking about eventually going back to school for her full teaching credential. She called me last month on a random Tuesday. Not because anything had happened, but just because she was taking a walk and thought of me. And we talked for 45 minutes about nothing important and everything real, which is the only kind of conversation that has ever felt like home to me. I've been asked, since some of this has become known within the family, whether I regret the test, whether I think it was fair, whether there was a better way to find out what I found out. I think about this genuinely. I do. I don't think performing a crisis is a good way to evaluate relationships, and if I were giving advice to someone else, I would probably say don't do it. There are kinder and more honest ways to learn who people are. Tell them the truth about what you need. Ask for help when you actually need it. Watch how they respond. The thing is, I had done that. For years, in smaller ways that didn't involve made-up scenarios, I had asked for things: time, attention, effort, from someone to remember what I'd told them, and the pattern of responses I got was the same pattern I found when I deliberately looked for it. The test didn't tell me anything I didn't already know. It just made the knowing undeniable. What I didn't expect was that the hardest part wouldn't be the confrontations, it would be the grief. Grieving the mother I kept hoping would become someone different. Grieving the sister relationship I'd watched other people have and quietly wanted my whole life. Grieving the version of family that exists in the imagination before you're old enough to see clearly. That grief is real, and I'm not going to pretend it isn't. But here is also what is real. I eat breakfast in my kitchen with afternoon light, and I am not afraid of my own future. I have a person in my life who called me on a random Tuesday just to talk. I have a room I decorated with things I actually like. I have a cat named after a woman I barely knew but who saw me across 4 decades and a pile of legal documents and wrote 8 words that changed the architecture of my whole life. I hope this gives you room to breathe. It did, Ruthie. It really did. If you've ever been the one in your family who was overlooked, I want you to hear this. The people who show up when you have nothing to offer them are the ones who were always worth keeping. And sometimes the most radical thing you can do for yourself is stop waiting for the people who were supposed to show up to finally decide to do it. You're allowed to build something new. You're allowed to decide who your family actually is. I'm still learning that. But for the first time in my life, I have room to. If this story resonated with you, leave a comment below. I'd love to know if you have a Delia in your life. And if you're still looking for yours, I hope you find them soon. Subscribe to Recovery Stories for more. We're just getting started.